morning, everyone, and thank you for being here. Today we have Grace Stafford with us. It's my pleasure to welcome Grace to our seminar series. Grace is the postdoctoral assistant for late antiquity and early Christian archaeology at the University of Vienna. She completed her doctorate at Oxford in 2021 and has since worked in the Kunsthistorische Institute in Florence and at the History Department of the University of Warsaw before moving to Vienna. Her research interests focus on women and gender in late antiquity, with particular interest in what visual and material culture can tell us about women's experiences of early Christianity. She is currently completing the manuscript of a book about the intersection of gender, pilgrimage, and asceticism in late antique East, and pursuing a new project on the archaeology of slavery. Grace, it's a pleasure to have you with us. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Maria. Let me share my PowerPoint presentation. And thank you very much for that kind introduction and for the invitation to talk to you all today. Where is it? There we go. Okay, can you see my presentation all right?
It's coming up. We're waiting for it to.
Okay. Yeah, are we good?
Perfect.
Perfect. All right. So today I'm going to talk to you about Saint Thecla, a figure with which I think you'll all be quite familiar. My paper will examine the cult of Thecla from the perspective of an archaeologist, and I will specifically look at pilgrimage access to Thecla's cult at her shrine in Seleukeia. Before I begin, though, I want to give you a little bit of context about the background of my paper. What I'm presenting here is drawn from the book manuscript, which Maria just described, that I'm currently preparing on the intersection between gender, pilgrimage, and asceticism in the late antique East. And that explores really the tension between space, sanctity, and gender, and how all this was negotiated at ascetic pilgrimage sites. Put more simply, it looks at how female pilgrims could access holy men and shrines run by men's monastic communities, and how male pilgrims could access holy women and shrines run by women's monastic communities. Thecla's shrine makes a really interesting case study in this context. It was a popular pilgrimage destination centered around a revered female ascetic that also had a prominent women's monastery, as well as groups of male and female ascetics living in association with the site. I'm going to begin my talk today with a brief introduction to Thecla and her shrine, and I apologize if I'm merely repeating material you already know. But given that the idea of this series was to bring together people from different backgrounds working on the followers of the apostles, I thought it would be useful to give some general information, especially regarding the state of archaeological excavations, with which you might be a little bit less familiar. After that, I'll provide a brief discussion of access to the site for male and female pilgrims and try to give you a picture of how access to Thecla compared to other shrines. Lastly, I'm going to discuss the relocation of the center of the shrine in the late 5th century. This relocation has been convincingly argued in a recent article by Philip Pillhofer, and I would like to build on this argument and suggest a potential reason for the relocation of the center of the shrine. So, Thecla was a follower of Paul. After hearing him preach in her hometown of Iconium in Asia Minor, she gave up a promising marriage to dedicate herself to virginity. She then followed Paul around, preaching, teaching, and surviving various attempts to martyr her before eventually returning to Iconium and ending her life in Seleukeia, modern Silifke in Turkey. We hear Thecla's story from the Acts of Paul and Thecla, which was probably written in the late 2nd century. Now, despite the brevity with which the Acts mention Thecla's time in Seleukeia, a shrine was established on a hill just outside the city and became a major pilgrimage hub. We don't know precisely when it was established, but we know that both Gregory of Nazianzus and Egeria made visits in the second half of the 4th century. From Egeria's description, we know that there was a church surrounded by a wall and accommodation for a large number of male and female ascetics. Our next source comes from the Life and Miracles of Thecla, which was written or compiled around the middle of the 5th century by an anonymous cleric associated with the shrine. It records a biography of the saint based around the earlier acts and a collection of 46 posthumous miracles which take place in and around the shrine. The biographical section includes additional material on Thecla's activities in Seleucia, recounting how she established herself as an ascetic on the hill which became the site of her shrine. It also mentions the end of Thecla's life, in which she miraculously sank into the earth to escape a violent mob. According to the text, the altar of her church was erected on the precise spot where she disappeared. A popular pilgrimage site grew on the site, and Thecla enacted many miracles at her shrine and in the neighbouring region. The details of the life and miracles reflect an organisation similar to that described by Egeria. Thecla's cult was centred around a church, and ascetics played prominent roles in the narrative. The miracles in particular mention the presence of a primary community of virgins who lived in an area attached to the church. They are very prominent in the miracle narratives, caring for visitors, receiving miracles, and communicating Thecla's desires and frustrations. Our textual sources then provide us with a relatively clear picture of how the site was organised in the 4th and first half of the 5th century. Unfortunately, though, there is very little archaeological evidence for these early phases. The shrine of Thecla underwent a major reorganisation and elaboration during the second half of the 5th century, probably around the reign of the Emperor Zeno, who dedicated a new church to the saint at her shrine. The redevelopment of the late 5th and early 6th centuries saw a huge wave of construction, including at least 4 churches, as well as numerous cisterns, water systems, and a bathhouse. This redevelopment phase is by far the most visible in the archaeological record and really obscures a lot of our knowledge about earlier phases. This in turn is then complicated by the history of excavation at the site. Thecla's shrine has seen just one season of excavation in 1907, probably only lasting about a month. And as you can imagine, these excavations were very limited in scope and scale, and their published findings have been contested ever since their publication in 1930. A handful of surveys were then conducted by Turkish colleagues in the 1990s, and these surveys were then resumed in the mid-2010s and seem to have been largely completed in 2023. These surveys are really invaluable because they provide us with a lot of new information about the site, such as the extent of the walls surrounding the Thecla Basilica, the water infrastructure, which included an aqueduct bringing water from some 18 kilometers away, the presence of extensive and largely unexplored burial areas in the north and the south, and the extensive and continued use of spolia from the site in the local area. Very, very close to the shrine is the modern village of Bejeli, which contains a large amount of reused material from Thecla's shrine. The huge amount of architectural fragments, decorative architectural fragments that have been documented by the survey team also lead them to suggest that there were many, many more monumental structures at the shrine than we know about. However, these are surveys rather than excavations, which means that many questions remain unanswered. Most of the site is privately owned, which is the greatest obstacle to excavation work. Without excavation, a nuanced and detailed analysis of the layout of the shrine is simply not possible, as is a better understanding of this phasing and dating of a lot of the buildings. What we can know is that the redevelopment phase of the late 5th century, the only phase that's really visible to us in the current situation, seems to have expanded and monumentalized the facilities available at the shrine. The extent to which they changed the original 4th century organization is very difficult to assess, as the 4th century church visited by Egeria has not been identified with certainty. What the archaeological remains do tell us is that the center of Thecla's cult in the late 5th century was a cave in which a small basilica was constructed and then a massive church on top called the Thecla Basilica, which was built very slightly later. Many scholars identify this church with the one built by Emperor Zeno. Now, I don't know whether you can see my cursor on the screen here, but this is it's the best quality recent site plan that is available online. There are a couple of more recent ones, but the quality is not very good and you can't really see the labels on it. So I'm showing you the one from 2019. So you can see the huge extent of the site, the road that runs down the middle of it, and most of the buildings and structures that are visible to us at the moment. So we have the 2 necropolis in the north and the south. We have the North Church, the so-called Cupola Church, the Thecla Basilica here with the cave church underneath, and a huge range of especially cisterns and a bathhouse just in the middle there, the hammam. And here is the village, so you can really tell just how close it is to the archaeological area. I also wanted to show you a picture of what the site looked like, at least in 2008, so a little while ago now, so you can get an idea of what we're working with. A site very rich for survey. As you can see, a lot of still standing remains, including fragments of the Thecla Basilica. I've included another picture here with some cars for scale, so you can see just how monumental this church was, this late 5th century construction. So an incredibly rich site. We know there's a lot there. The underground church, the cave church, is still in use as a site of worship of Thecla today. If you're interested in Thecla, you can still go and visit her nuns and check the site out for yourself. We know it's incredibly rich, but no excavations. Quite frustrating, as I'm sure you can imagine. So before we continue with the discussion of the relocation of Thecla's cult within the site and its implications for access and authority, I want to pause for a minute to discuss pilgrimage to Thecla more generally. Thecla's site provided relatively open access to all pilgrims, male and female. The miracle collections record Thecla helping provide for a range of visitors: male, female, lay, ascetic, clerical, rich, poor, everyone. We've also already mentioned that Egeria made a visit, as did Gregory of Nazianzus, and that the site was patronized by Zeno. The archaeology does not permit us to understand how such open access was facilitated at the site, but we can make some suppositions. It appears from the miracles that both men and women had access to the main church and the open spaces that surrounded it. While women were clearly central to Thecla's cult, as has been noted by numerous scholars, her shrine did not greatly privilege female pilgrims. Men were provided with clear access to the saint. This was probably facilitated, at least in part, by the presence of communities of both male and female ascetics. In this way, visitors of both sexes could be catered for and accommodated easily. The only hint we get of advantages for female pilgrims comes in the context of the primary women's monastic community that was associated with the church. In several miracles, we hear of female visitors who stayed alongside the virgins and through this had privileged access to Thecla. For example, in one miracle, we hear the story of Dionysia, a woman who was discerning to join the community and leave her family. She was staying with the virgins when Thecla appeared to her in the middle of the night to comfort her in making her decision. This was apparently very helpful for Dionysia, but rather shocking for the virgin who woke up in the middle of the night to find herself confronted with the saint comforting her bedfellow. It therefore seems that female pilgrims could, in certain circumstances, find accommodation in the monastery attached to the church itself, surely a privileged location and one that was closely associated with Thecla's intercession. The members of the female community themselves are also very prominent characters in the miracle narratives and evidently had key roles in organizing the shrine and its accessibility to pilgrims and visitors. This open access to Thecla's shrine for pilgrims is simultaneously surprising and unsurprising. On the one hand, it's a relatively rare example of a pilgrimage site focused around a female ascetic and hosting a primary female community that still provided open access to male visitors. Most holy women were far more restrictive in their policies towards male pilgrims. As were women's monasteries that housed important relics. Most of the holy women, for example, that I examine in my book, only received female pilgrims and male clergy. On the other hand, attitudes to pilgrims at shrines dedicated to holy people often reflected the attitude of the holy person themselves towards the opposite sex. For example, Saint Simeon the Stylite the Elder at Kalatziman did not receive female petitioners and fully segregated himself from women. Then, after his death, women were not allowed to enter the cruciform martyrium that surrounded his column. So on the plan here of Kalatziman, you can see the cruciform martyrium that was constructed after the holy man's death with his column in the center. Women were not allowed to enter. They had to stand outside the door around about here. Despite the holy man being dead, they're essentially segregated from the relic in the form of the column. Thecla, though, had not been a shy and retiring hermit who rejected all contact with men. Rather, she was known for her relatively radical approach to female piety, dressing as a man and traveling to follow Paul. Within this context, an open approach to pilgrims makes more sense, and gender segregation may have been perceived as illogical at the shrine. As has been recognized, though, by several other scholars, Thecla's cult, and particularly the miracle collection that was drawn up, really went out of its way to make Thecla a saint for everyone. Her miracles begin with Thecla defeating the local gods, Stafford and Apollo, Aphrodite and Zeus, and she then takes on many of their responsibilities, such as healing, defending cities and towns from attack, and solving domestic disputes and marital arguments. Thecla's shrine really had aspirations to be all things to all people, a kind of one-stop shop for your saintly needs. Within this context, limiting access of male visitors would really have been a strategically bad decision, so it's no wonder that it maintained open access for everyone. In this last section of my talk, I would like to return to the relocation of Thecla's cult in the late 5th century. As we've seen, the site underwent a radical renovation at the end of the 5th and beginning of the 6th century. This included the construction of numerous monumental facilities, including that small basilica in a natural cave and the massive three-aisle church on top of it, the Thecla Basilica. Many scholars have assumed that this complex was developed from, or just entirely replaced, the 4th century church visited by Egeria. However, it's been noted by several scholars that this really does not fit well with the textual evidence. In a recent article, Philip Pilhofer has eloquently presented the argument that this construction marked not only the redevelopment of the site, but also the relocation of Thecla's cult centre from elsewhere on the hill. Pilhofer builds on suggestions by previous scholars to show that the church mentioned by Egeria could not have been located on the same spot as the 5th century Thecla Basilica. If you want to understand all his nuanced arguments in full, I highly suggest that you go and read the article yourself. What I'm going to do here, though, is I'm going to present what I think to be the strongest element of his argument, and then I'll suggest a possible reason why the cult was moved. The strongest argument really for the relocation of the shrine is the way in which the cave is described in textual sources. Firstly, No sources mention the cave as a locus for Thecla's cult before the middle of the 5th century. We first hear of it in the Miracles. In this text, the cave is explicitly located in a different place from the main church. In Miracle 36, we hear about the cave for the first time when the author tells us that Thecla caused a miraculous spring to appear in response to a pestilence that struck the city. It appeared, quote, in a cave to the west of her church, lying just opposite it. The author then goes on to explain that this cave was a very peaceful place where you could pray in absolute tranquility, and that visitors to the church also went to the cave because Thecla was said to spend time there because she liked the quiet and the solitude. As argued convincingly by Pilhofer, from the perspective of the author of the Miracles, the cave was originally in a separate location to Thecla's church and developed as a pilgrimage destination relatively late. Two late variant endings of the Acts of Paul and Thecla also seem to respond to this new tradition by reporting that the saint lived in a cave when she returned to Seleucia, and explaining that this was in fact the site of her disappearance into the earth. The miracle itself appears either to explain why people were visiting the cave, or to support or establish a new tradition that would make the cave popular with visitors. Either way, it seems clear that the site of the cave, and by extension the cave church and the Thecla Basilica, was located at some distance from the 4th century church visited by Egeria and described in the Miracles. At some point towards the end of the 5th century, and after the compilation of the Life and Miracles, the focus of Thecla's cult was relocated from an as yet unidentified church to a new complex centered on the cave. But why did this shift take place? Moving a cult was no small matter, as shrines and martyria were often connected to the saint and their life or their death. The Miracles tells us, as we've already mentioned, that the altar of Thecla's church was constructed on the exact site where she disappeared into the ground. Yet in later versions, her disappearance was relocated to the cave. Why did this tradition change? And what happened to the Monastery of the Virgins and access for pilgrims? Given the lack of reliable archaeological data, any answer to these questions must remain speculative. One contributing factor, though, may have been tensions between authority figures and stakeholders surrounding the shrine. As has been noted, events in the Life and Miracles suggest a certain amount of tension between the shrine and local authorities, and as a whole, the text takes an ambiguous attitude to local bishops. Bishops are routinely lauded for their faithfulness and for their virtue, but they're often mentioned only when they're embroiled in embarrassing or difficult circumstances. Dexianus, the bishop of Seleucia, is healed twice by Thecla, once after he was thrown from a skittish horse that he couldn't control, and another time when he was possessed by a demon while he was on the toilet. He was also punished by Thecla when he moved some of her treasure from her church into Seleucia because he was worried it would be pillaged by raiders. At the time, he was an attendant of the shrine and removed all of the gold and silver decoration to the town. Thecla was unimpressed and appeared to some of the virgins sleeping in the church, shouting that this unfaithful priest had robbed her. Bishop Symposius of Seleucia converted from Arianism when Thecla prevented him from destroying a mosaic in her church that proclaimed the consubstantiality of the Trinity. Marianus, bishop of nearby Tarsus, was punished with death when he attempted to stop his congregation from traveling to Thecla's festival. Bishop Maximus, Dexianus' predecessor as bishop of Seleucia, was rebuked by Thecla for daring to allow a man to be buried in her church. The author of the Miracles was also evidently in a long-running personal dispute with Bishop Basil of Seleucia, who had apparently excommunicated him. All of these accounts are less than favourable to local religious authorities and reveal tensions over who had control of the shrine and its wealth. The miracles concerning the prevention of the burial in the church, the removal of the treasure, and the dispute between the author and Basil all seem particularly pointed. In the first two, the dispute is framed as being between Thecla and the bishop, but the implied tension is between ecclesiastical authorities and local ascetics and clerics. When Dexianos removes the wealth of the church to Seleukeia, it is the virgins who witness Thecla's wrath and report her displeasure, forcing Dexianos to return the treasure. We should perhaps consider it was the ascetics themselves who were irritated that the wealth of their church had been taken, whether with the best of intentions or for more cynical motivations. Likewise, the protestation against the burial of a layman in the church speaks to a sense of outrage over the promotion of lay people over ascetics and clerics, and perhaps who had control over Thecla's church itself. It seems possible then that a contributing factor to the relocation of Thecla's cult was the desire of local authorities to minimize the importance of the shrine administration and create a fresh start at an emerging locus of cult. The arrival of imperial patronage and the decision to overhaul shrine facilities could have provided just the conditions and excuses for the Bishop of Seleukeia to take over greater control. As for what happened to the virgins of Thecla, we don't know. It seems likely the women's community continued to maintain a presence at the site, but this can't be confirmed. Several funerary inscriptions from the area reference a monastery of Thecla and preserve the names of women identified as the nuns of Thecla. It's very difficult, though, to date them with any precision. If the living quarters of the female ascetics had been detached from the primary church complex, then it seems likely that both they and female pilgrims would have lost some of the privileged access to the saint that they previously enjoyed. Just as a side note, in a previous lecture on Thecla given in this series by Angel Naro Sanchez, at the very end there was a question about women who took the name of Thecla and what this can tell us about her cult. And I'm very pleased to say that Nuna Terry at the University of Brussels has an article coming out imminently in the Bulletin for the Institute of Classical Studies on the name Thecla in epigraphic sources from rough Cilicia in late antiquity, tracing who is giving or taking the name of Thecla, where and why. So if you're still interested in that topic, then I highly recommend you look out for that article, which should be appearing any day now. The case of pilgrimage to Thecla's shrine at Seleukeia opens many questions regarding access to and authority over the cults of saints and holy people in late antiquity. It appears that Thecla's shrine was unusually accessible for a pilgrimage site with an emphasis on women's asceticism, a situation that was probably supported by Thecla's own unorthodox lifestyle. Male and female pilgrims were given easy access to the cult, but female ascetics and female pilgrims received slightly more privileged access, at least until the reforms of the late 5th century. The religious, political, and economic importance of the shrine is evidenced by its long-term popularity and its ability to attract imperial patronage. Such popularity was manifested physically in the extensive redevelopment of the facilities in the second half of the 5th century. Changes to the layout of the site likely had a significant impact on existing patterns of access and may have altered who controlled that access itself. Controlling access to pilgrimage sites was highly desirable in late antiquity, and our sources are full of stakeholders vying for access to saints, relics, and holy people. As the premier saint of the period, the premier female saint of the period, Thecla's shrine would certainly have been attractive to many different people for many different reasons. Finally, the history of archaeological investigations at the site remind us that issues of access and authority still impact our ability to study sites today. A better understanding of the functioning of the shrine is limited by access to the site and the ability to excavate. Surveys have provided incredibly valuable data, but have in some ways raised more questions than they can answer. Until archaeologists can investigate the site further, we must be content with hypotheses.
Thank you, Grace, for that fascinating paper. As you can see, all the clapping hand emojis coming up. If you have any questions, once the applause subsides, please raise your hand or you can put it in the chat. Margaret has a question. Margaret, please.
Hi, thank you for a fascinating talk. Possibly I missed it because I was moving around in the room a bit, but is there a translation of the miracles of Thecla that you were quoting? I would love to be able to read them myself. I'm sure others would.
Yes, absolutely. It's the translation by Scott Fitzgerald Johnson, which with me just in case. There it is.
Wonderful.
It's in the Dumbarton Oaks series.
Is that in the Dumbarton Oaks series?
It is, yes. It's Miracle Tales from Byzantium, so it doesn't give it away in the title that it's got the life and miracles in it. But yeah, it's great translation.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. A great series.
Thank you, Margaret. Matthew, you have a question?
Yes, thank you, Grace, so much for this. I'm sorry if I have missed this, but is there any valuable epigraphy from the site that could shed light on the life of the ascetics there and the pilgrimage activity?
So we have a number of funerary inscriptions. There is, well, we know from surveys that there are a huge number of graves at the site, at least I think 70 in the southern and slightly less in the north, or the other way around. So there's a lot of burials there, and there is some epigraphy that's been documented, which do mention various nuns of Thecla, some with the name Thecla, some with the name Paula or Paulina. So they're clearly engaging with this tradition of Thecla as a follower of Paul. But these funerary epitaphs are very brief. Often they just give us a name and not much else. And these are really things that just people have come across. They're not things that have been systematically studied in the way that we would want them to be. As I mentioned, if you want to know more, Nunitary will be publishing an article imminently on Thecla in Rough Cilicia, and this includes most of the epigraphy from the shrine that mentions Thecla, which is a relatively large amount, and which is a great read. I highly recommend it.
Thank you.
Perhaps Madalena, please go ahead.
Yeah, I suppose you can hear me. Is it okay? Does it work? Yeah. So
yes.
Thank you very much, Grace. Very, very interesting presentation. So I have a question about, so you mentioned that Thecla's cult sought to make her attractive to all kinds of visitors. And so how does it work when you're thinking that, I think that you mentioned at some point that she took the responsibilities of local pagan cults. So could you develop a bit on that?
Sure. So the first 3 or 4 miracles in the miracle collection basically tell the story of how Thecla takes over this particular site. And in order to do so, she has to go around defeating all of the older pagan gods. So we see her defeating Sarpedon Apollo, who's a kind of local mix of a hero called Sarpedon and Apollo, who does a lot of healing kind of miracles. We see her taking on Zeus and taking on Aphrodite. So she kind of exercises the region of these pagan demons, if you will, in order to set herself up at the shrine. Then in her following miracles, we see her performing a lot of the kind of tasks that we might expect of these people. So, for example, she does a lot of healing. This is something that Sarpedon and Apollo would have done in the pre-Christian period. Likewise, she intervenes in a lot of people's personal relationships. She helps women who've lost their husbands get their husbands back. Things like that. She intervenes when someone's getting married and they've lost their marriage belt, and the kind of things perhaps we would expect Aphrodite to cover again in a pre-Christian period. So it seems like she's trying to make herself kind of all things to all people and take on all of these roles, or that's what the anonymous author of the miracles is trying to do. She then, throughout the miracles, performs an astonishingly wide range of tasks, everything from healing, defending cities from attack, punishing heretics, punishing her own followers, protecting women from sexual assault. all kinds of stuff. She really, really performs a much wider range of miracles than we see with most other female saints from late antiquity. And I think she probably gets the closest to what kind of Peter Brown's Holy Man represents, this kind of public mediator or something like that. I think she's the closest woman to that kind of pattern.
Grace, if I may, I have a follow-up question to Natalina's. Is there any material evidence of this taking over of pagan potential sites? If I know, especially because you mentioned Spolia somewhere, so I was
Yeah.
wondering if it's more.
Yeah, so potentially yes, in the sense that some of the material that has been recovered during the surveys is certainly pre-late antique. It's probably second century or something like that, especially large building elements, things like columns. But where those things are coming from is a completely different question. And again, something that we really can't tell until we're able to conduct investigations at the site and figure out what's going on in the dating and the phasing. So I think it's definitely possible that there was a shrine on the hill, perhaps to one or more of these pagan gods before Thecla arrives. They're certainly reusing second, third century building elements, but where these are coming from is another question. They could be coming from Seleucia proper, for example, or from the surrounding region. So it's possible, but unfortunately, again, it's one of those frustrating questions that we just can't know until we have better access to the site.
Thank you for that. Philip, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you also from my side. Very interesting. I like the fact that someone reads the Miracle Collection and finds out new things about how the cult worked in Silifke, and also how you took on these gender-related questions of access in regard to these texts. That was very interesting. And I also like your point about that it might be different groups that led to the fact that the cult site developed further. My question would be, well, I do have one question and two short remarks. So starting with the question, my question would be, do you have any idea, close ideas how this has been working? I mean, you pointed to these tensions, and it's a very good point. I have not thought about it yet. But do you have a close idea how this has been working? And regarding the remarks, one very short one, the friend and enemy of Emperor Zeno, called Illus from the region, he named his daughter also Thecla. It's not graphic evidence. And the other remark regarding Maria's question, well, regarding these four stories on the pagan gods who are like exorcised. From my point of view, it's rather late stories, just explaining stuff and maybe not too historical, but not on the side of Thecla, but in Silefke, which is like a kilometer or 2 kilometers away. We do have a large temple, pagan temple, who has been rebuilt as a church. So archaeologically, you can show that this temple has become a church in late antiquity. And of course, there have been hypotheses about this being the temple of Zeus that has been transformed into a St. Paul's church, as it is in the Miracle Collection. It's just a sentence where it is said, well, and Thecla removed Zeus and made his temple. I think it's like a guest house of Paul or something. Katagogion is the Greek word, I think. So this might be archaeological evidence, but it's not too clear if it's really fitting the stories. So that was my remarks.
Can I just ask a clarificatory question? When you say, how does the system work? The system for pilgrims, the system for ascetics, how?
Oh, no, sorry. My question was regarding when you said that the rebuilding of the cult site, that it is related to the tensions. My question is just
No.
if you have like an idea what was going on there, a more detailed idea, that you just showed us the evidence now, and if you have a close idea of what was going on, and you did not want to say it in the paper, but now in the discussion maybe.
Okay, I understand where you're coming from now. Unfortunately, the evidence really is circumstantial, but in the book that I'm working on, I do have several much better evidenced examples where it really does seem like something like this is going on. Basically, where a cult starts to get really popular and the local bishop says, I want a slice of that, and then acts to try and take over the relics or the shrine or whatever it is. So, for example, in the life of Saint Febronia, the local bishop builds a martyrium for her outside of her monastery and comes to the community to take her remains away. And the nuns protest. They say, please don't do this. Don't take our sister. The bishop insists. This goes back and forth for a while. He tries to forcibly take her bones away, and Febronia performs a miracle that paralyzes him and prevents him from being able to do it. Eventually, there's all these negotiations, and it's agreed that he can take a single tooth with him to his new martyrium. I think in that text, we get a really clear idea of how these tensions work, that either the local administrative community or the ecclesiastical community sees the benefit, political, economic, religious, of having control over these kinds of pilgrimage sites and acts to try and take that control. In the case of Thecla, it's more of a feeling you get from reading the miracles that at least the author or compiler of the miracles is not a huge fan of the bishops of Seleucia or of the bishops of the surrounding area. He clearly has his own personal problems with them, but the way he frames these miracles, I think often when you read about the miracles of Thecla, you'll read something that says, oh yeah, she healed Bishop Dexianus twice. And that's meant to make us think, oh, she really likes him. That's great. But actually, we only hear about embarrassing stuff he does that requires Thecla to help him. And I think that speaks to a certain level of tension. And I wonder whether, in the context of that tension, when imperial patronage arrives and there's an opportunity to redevelop the site, that's a chance for the bishops in particular to make a move, basically, and to relocate Thecla's shrine and to try and minimize the importance of the virgins, potentially other stakeholders as well. How that functions in practice is a really difficult question, and it's really difficult to see archaeologically as well. The key would be, I guess, if we did manage to excavate the site and we had more epigraphic information, such as dedicatory inscriptions that mention the bishop or something like that. It's possible that we might find something like that, but you never know. So unfortunately, I have no satisfying answer to your question. This is really a feeling I get based on the texts and based on your assessment of the relocation of the site in the context of other cults in late antiquity, where we can see very clearly that this is happening, and that local authorities are really trying to take control. And I think that one of the interesting things we get from Thecla, from some other shrines as well, is that we can kind of see how hagiography and archaeology kind of come together and they inform each other. And that some of the texts have to start explaining the material situation and vice versa to kind of make the materiality of the shrine make sense.
Great. Thank you so much for your answer. And it's really good to see like the evidence from Thecla in context of the comparative material you quoted. So that's great. Looking forward to your book. And as we are talking about the excavations, we have someone here who's connected closely to the team, Oiku Balci. I do not know if you hear us. If you wish, you can say something about the ongoing research. Are you having a survey this year, or just go ahead?
Hello, everyone. I've been attending the survey research since 2019, and I don't think that we will have any further research for this summer, but we will see. I mean, there has been some problem with the excavation team last year, and that's why we need to pause the process. And yeah, I don't know what will be going on with the future, but for now, I can say that it's not ongoing for this summer, but yeah.
Would you like to say something about your recent work or your last work on site, something?
Actually, I was mostly working on the cupola church on the site, and this was my master's thesis at 2020. And actually, I'm working on a publication about it right now to be able to reach more wider audience in terms of the my findings about the after my field survey. And yeah, actually, I'm now pursuing on my PhD studies, but I'm working on different fields, so I don't much involved in this topic for I mean intensively right now. Yeah, that's all I can say. But it's really nice to have your opinions and your recent research about the Thecla, and yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Grace, if I may ask another question. You sh on your first slide, was it, I hope I'm recognizing it correctly. It's a flask with Thecla on it, is it? Please correct me if I'm wrong. What could you talk about other such material evidence and if they're found at these sites and or where are they found and what do you make of them?
Sure. So the image I showed on the first slide is a plaque rather than a flask, but we do have a lot of these pilgrimage flasks, as you rightly say, with Thecla's kind of failed martyrdom. Do we call it that on it, where she's being attacked by lions or similar, often in concert with St. Menas on the other side. And Stephen Davis has done a lot of work on the cult of Thecla in Egypt, where these things come from. Probably there's another pilgrimage shrine to Thecla that we haven't found somewhere in Egypt, perhaps not that far from the shrine of Menas at Abu Minna near Alexandria. So we see this sort of representation of Thecla's martyrdom in that context, which is relatively unusual. These depictions of female martyrdoms in particular are not common in late antiquity. Thecla is one of the only examples that has this kind of iconography that is quite widespread. There's also, of course, I think Renata could probably talk much better about it than I could. She's publishing a book on the site near Ephesus, where we have representations of Thecla and Paul. And Thecla does appear every now and again in collections of female saints, for example, in representations of saints in mosaics and things like that as a virgin martyr. There's quite a lot of material evidence for Thecla. There's also the Thecla catacombs in Rome. There's a very bizarre tradition that says that when she disappears into the ground, she actually goes to Rome looking for Paul. And she pops back up in Rome. And that's why there's this catacomb of Thecla in Rome, which I think is an absolutely charming tradition. So we have the catacombs of Thecla. There is quite a lot of dispersed evidence for her. There's nuns called Thecla that show up all over the empire, in Spain, also in Britain, even as late as the 6th, 7th century, we have nuns showing up called Thecla. She's clearly incredibly popular, which makes the lack of archaeological investigations at her pilgrimage site all the more disappointing, to be honest. And unfortunately, the hands of colleagues are completely tied. They are doing absolutely all they can do to investigate this site and publishing regularly all this incredibly important data. But as with all archaeological sites, you're tied by who you can get access from, where you can get access to, who owns the land, all these kinds of things. So yeah, while we have a relatively large amount of material and visual culture related to Thecla, the one site where we would have loads and loads of it, we can see it but can't get to it.
Gosh, that is unfortunate and very annoying, but but I guess that's how it stands. But I was wondering, Renata, do you have any follow-up to what Grace just said? Because as she mentioned, you're working on Thecla as well, and especially the material culture from Ephesus.
Renate, might you like to comment on your work in relation to what Grace said about your work on this? You may wish to unmute first.
I
Oh,
don't think
we'll
she
just
wants to
have to
talk
read
about
your
it.
book. We'll just
Yeah,
have to
we'll have
read
to
her
wait for the
book.
book. I think it's almost out, so we can read it very soon.
Oh, yes, we are definitely looking forward to that. Thank you so much, Grace. Dan, I know you have a question.
I do. Thank you very much, and very, very illuminating paper. Of course, I'd like to. I mean, I'm curious about the topic that you discussed towards the end with Philip on moving cults. You mentioned that moving cults could be difficult for a series of reasons, but how often do we actually have in late antiquity moving cults in the manner you described for Thecla, rather than just chopping a tooth? How often do we get that situation reproduced elsewhere?
Almost never, which is why it's so unusual. It's so difficult. I think with Thecla, we have two factors at play. The first factor is that they don't move her from the hill. She stays on the hill, but they move her within the site and slightly change the tradition. So it's a small change. They're not trying to completely relocate her to another place, right? So that's number one. Number two is that the connection between Thecla and this hill is relatively weak. There's no body. There's no bodily relics, even though they start showing up later. In the tradition, she sinks into the ground miraculously to escape a violent mob. She disappears. So there's no grave of Thecla or anything like that. There's just this point where she disappears into the ground. And that probably makes it slightly easier, I think, to relocate her. This lack of a really fixed position. But that's where I think the connection between the archaeology and the hagiography becomes really, really interesting, and where, as I say, we need to try and tie more together the textual sources with the archaeology at the shrines of these holy people, because we can see these changes happening, especially after the death of a saint or a holy person. Kalat is another great example. Once Simeon dies, they build this massive complex around his column, and it seems like a men's monastery basically takes over running the site. And as the site gets more popular, as it attracts more pilgrims, as it gets more important, access starts to be restricted more and more, both for men and for women. Laymen also have their experience restricted at the site. And we can again combine the very rich textual evidence that we have for Kalat and St. Simeon with a really good archaeology of the site to see exactly how this is developing before, in the lifetime of the saint, and afterwards, after his death as well. For Thecla, I would love to be able to do more of that. It would be really great if we could ever excavate the site to then compare it to this really rich textual tradition and to see how the hagiographer is also in dialogue with, sort of as a stakeholder at the site, providing or not providing access to certain people. So yeah, in terms of relocation, not common at all, and often causes issues. But with Thecla, it's probably slightly easier since she's got a relatively weak connection to this particular point in the shrine.
Very, very interesting, especially, thank you. And especially the fact that you're stressing that in this case, we kind of see how the literary body around her can be put in, develops in parallel and can be put in dialogue with the cult, so with the archaeological data. That's not very often the case. So this is beautiful. Thank you. Thank you very much.
That's what I'm trying to do in the book. We'll see if it works.
We have a question. Thank you, Grace. We have a question from Rachel. Rachel, please go ahead.
Thank you so much for a really interesting introduction and overview of the site. My question is more from your perspective, what you're hoping, is there anything you particularly hope might be found there in the next, when excavations can take place? What you're particularly interested to see?
I don't think we have any guarantees that there will ever be excavations. as I've said, Turkish colleagues are doing the absolute most. And these surveys have been incredible, and they're publishing fantastic data, including, as we've already heard as well, a lot of master's theses from architecture students on particular monuments on the site, which is really developing our understanding of these buildings from an architectural standpoint. But we can't really speculate about what we might find if we could do excavations, because then I think we'd just end up being really sad that we couldn't do it. So unfortunately, I can't answer your question. But if we did get to do excavations, then whatever we found would be interesting and would be able to be contextualized within a range of very, very fascinating textual and archaeological data.
Thank you, Grace, and thank you all for being here this morning. Grace, this was a fantastic paper. I hope you enjoyed the question and answer and the conversation afterwards. I think we can wrap it up now, if there are no other questions. Thank you all for being here. We look forward to seeing you next month for Margaret's paper, actually. Thank you very much, and I hope you have a wonderful week.
Thank you.